Okay, so ladies, tonight, if we were to take a survey and I would ask you to write down every single thing that has ever hurt you, everything that has ever wounded you, everything that has ever scarred you, every relationship that went bad, everything where there was abuse, where there was, terrible things, every single betrayal, every deed that was ever done to you in anger. If I asked you to write that down, you and I would start writing now and write until Jesus comes back. Because the world can't contain all the lists of all the hurts and the wounds and all the reasons that we need to give and receive forgiveness. And the reason for that is because we love poorly. We have been loved poorly, and we loved poorly, and we hurt each other, and I have great sound. Yes? No? That's a wrong done to me. I need it corrected. No. But we wound each other. Maybe a handheld. You want to give me a handheld? Or switch mics with me? What would you like to do? Handheld, good idea. Thank you so much. Okay, we'll try that. All right, so it is impossible for us to record all the ways that we have been wounded and the ways that we have wounded other people. Well, in Matthew 18, Jesus tells a very disturbing story, and I'm going to read it to you. It's on the screen, but I'll read it to you too. So Matthew 18, 21 to 35. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, "Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother when he sins against me? Up to 7 times?" Jesus answered, "I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. The servant fell on his knees before him. 'Be patient with me,' he begged, 'and I will pay back everything.' The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. He grabbed him and began to choke him. 'Pay back what you owe me,' he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, 'Be patient with me, and I will pay you back.' But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. 'You wicked servant,' he said, 'I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?' In anger, his master turned him over to the jailers to be tortured until he could pay back all that he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother from your heart." I am very uncomfortable with this story. I wish it had one of those little asterisks that sometimes you find that would say, in the oldest manuscripts, this story is not found. But unfortunately, there is no little asterisk. This story is as genuine as the story comes. It is trustworthy. We know it's in all the early manuscripts. And what that means is that we have to pay attention to it. And there are 2 very profound truths in this passage that I want to cover really quickly with you. And the first is this, because they're going to help us as we try to restore and repair any broken relationships that we have. The first is, I have been forgiven, so I can forgive. The foundation for our ability to forgive that huge catalog of sins and wounds and damage that has been done to us starts with the fact that you and I have been forgiven, and so we can forgive. So picture with me that story again that Jesus tells, because here is a guy, a servant, and he's just going about his business one day. He's just doing his thing, nothing different. He had no idea that this was the day that his master was going to call him to account, but he did. He gets a summons to the king, and he goes to the king, and the king says, "You know what? You owe me 1,000 talents. You owe me like $1,000,000. And I need you to pay it right now. Because if you don't, I'm going to throw you and your family, your wife and your children, into debtor's prison, and you're going to rot there until you're able to pay the debt back." And this servant, who's just been going about his business, kind of hoping maybe the king wouldn't remember that he owed him this enormous amount of money, kind of says, please, 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 if you will just be patient with me, I promise I will pay it all back, every cent. Don't worry about it. I'm good for it. And the king says, okay, all right, I forgive you. It's done. You are free from this debt. Go on about your business. And so the servant leaves the master's presence completely amazed that he has been forgiven this huge debt. And he doesn't even know what to do, because there's no way he could have ever repaid that debt. There was no way. Even if he worked 24/7 for 50,000 years, he, as a little servant, could not have possibly repaid that debt. So let's just pause there for a moment, because the basis for forgiveness is understanding the enormity of the debt that you and I have been forgiven. You and I have been forgiven by God a debt that we could never, if we memorized the entire Bible, if we went to church every day of our lives, if we served the poor, if we gave our bodies to be burned, if we did everything that we could possibly remotely do that we thought might please God, could we ever do enough to have the debt that we owe him forgiven? We have been forgiven a debt that could never, ever be repaid. And it's all because of Jesus. And so you would think, all right, so you and I have received this enormous mercy, this grace that we could never have earned, this forgiveness of a debt that we could never repay. You would think that because of that, we would live in such gratitude for that we would be the most amazing forgivers of other people, because we've been forgiven. So we who have been forgiven, man, we are going to be amazing forgivers of other people. But there's a problem, because you and I don't really like to forgive. We don't really like to forgive. In fact, sometimes we refuse to do it. And the biggest barrier in reconciling and in restoring and in repairing relationships is often our inability or our unwillingness to forgive the massive debts that others have accrued to us. But instead of, God forgives me, therefore I forgive you, the way that we like to do it is, God has forgiven me and I don't forgive you. That's the way we want to play the game. But the problem with that is it's very distorted, and it's actually dangerous to our own spiritual lives. So the other truth we see first is that you and I have been forgiven a huge debt, so we can forgive. But what else we see in this passage is that the unforgiving become the unforgiven. So go back to this servant who has just been forgiven a debt that's larger than anything he could ever pay off, even with his very best efforts. And so he, who has just been forgiven this ginormous debt, goes out free, completely free and liberated. And one of the first things he does is he lays eyes on a fellow servant who owes him like $10. And he walks up to that guy who owes him $10, and he says, give me my money now. Today, right now, bucko, right now, cough it up. I need my money back. And the other servant says, oh, I can't. I don't have it. But if you'll be patient with me, I promise I will pay it all back. Really, I'm good for it. I'm good for it if you'll just give me a little time. And this servant who has been forgiven $1 million debt looks at the guy who owes him $10 and says, if you don't pay me now, on the spot, your wife and your children are going to be thrown, and you are thrown into debtor's prison until you can pay this debt back. You pay me now. Well, the guy says, I can't. I can't. So this servant, who evidently had a little seniority over the other one, makes sure that that man and his wife and his children are thrown into the debtor's prison. Well, the story gets back to the king. And the king is infuriated, absolutely infuriated and aghast, cannot believe that this has happened. And he calls in this servant who has been forgiven $1 million debt. And he says to him, hey, listen, I just heard this story. I heard that even though I just forgave you a debt that you could never in a million years repay, and instead of then going and being forgiving and kind and gracious and merciful with your fellow servant who owed you such a tiny amount, you have thrown that man and his family into debtor's prison. He says, you wicked servant. Here's what I will do to you, because you have been unforgiving You will be the unforgiven. You will now be thrown into debtor's prison. You will not get out. I don't know about you, but I see myself in that unforgiving servant way too many times. I could have auditioned for that part. I mean, my name, I'm sure, is written in there somewhere. Because the truth is, guys, when it comes to my sin and my weakness and my failures, I want God to just throw his mercy on me. I want him to just dump rivers of grace and mercy on me. I want understanding. I want compassion. I want to be able to say to him, but God, I know, I messed up, and I'm really sorry, and please have mercy on me. I was really having a bad day. God, you know where I was hurting that day, and you know what she said to me. And you know what he did to me. And you know that I've had it up to here, and I can't take it one more day, and I can't tolerate it, and I won't live with it, and I can't. And God, I know what I said was really out of line, but really it was her fault. So God, would you please have mercy on me? And I want God to show me understanding and forgive me time after time after time. But I'm going to be incredibly honest with you, and this is not the truth. I am not saying this just because it makes a nice point in a little message. The real truth of the evil that lurks in my heart is this. I want God to forgive me, but I don't really want him to forgive you if you've hurt me. Because I want him to throw the book at you. I want him to give you justice. Because you did wrong. I want mercy for myself, but I want justice for you. When the king gets wind of what the servant has done and throws him into the torturers, actually, so many of the translations try to make good. It's not even debtor's prison. I mean, he says, I'm throwing you to the torturers. And some of the commentaries try to say, oh, well, it probably didn't really mean that, I don't know that there's any way to make nice about that verse. Jesus is very clear. He says, at the very least, if you are unforgiving of other people, it will be very difficult for you to receive forgiveness yourself. And I've been in torture chambers. I've been where they held the Inquisition in Lima, Peru. I've been in the depths of a torture chamber and seen the medieval tools that were used on people. I've been in Cambodia. I've been in Tuol Sleng, where fellow Cambodians tortured and murdered each other. I've seen the weapons of torture. And they scar you just to look at them. And Jesus used this dramatic language to say that if we don't forgive each other, at the very least, we are consigning ourselves to an emotional prison where we are tortured by unforgiveness. I read this week. As long as we are unable to forgive, we keep ourselves chained to the unforgiven. We give them rent-free space in our mind, emotional shackles in our heart, and the right to torment us in the wee hours of the night. A friend of mine is a quadriplegic, and I was talking to her a few years ago. She's been in a wheelchair for 20 years, and she was asking me to pray for her because she had a bed sore. And for me, as a non-medical person, bed sore, it's just a little owie place, okay? It can't be that bad. No, bed sores, you guys, they have a way of, they don't look so bad on the outside sometimes, but it's a pressure. Like if you've lain in the same place for a long time and your skin gets kind of worn thin and all of a sudden there's a little hole, and that hole actually, as the infection starts to eat deeper and deeper and deeper into that hole in your skin, it can go to the bone, it can cause sepsis. You can die from a bed sore. Some of us, if we were really willing to be gut-level honest before God tonight, some of you have emotional bed sores. You have allowed, bed sores are a sign of neglect. Some of you have emotional bed sores where you have neglected to be forgiving. You have been forgiven but you have neglected to forgive, and it is emotionally eating away at the relationships in your life. And some of them you won't know that they're at that place until somebody looks at you and says, I'm done. Friendship's over. This relationship is over. I want out. And when you hear those words, you know that bitterness and unforgiveness and wounds have sunk deeply into the core of your soul. And it has caused damage and destruction that is very difficult to repair. Listen, it's time to forgive. It's time to forgive. It's time to stop telling the story of your wound. It's time to stop telling it. Listen, some of your friends, don't you notice it? Their eyes start to glaze over when you go through your spiel. You've told it so many times that if you turned your back, you'd see them going, because they know exactly what you're going to say, because you've said it over and over and over. You've told the story how she wounded you. You've told the story of how she betrayed you. You've told the story of how he left you. You've told the story of how they abused you. You've told the story and you've told the story and you've told the story, and the entire time you've not spoken from your healed scars. You're speaking from open wounds that are eating at your soul. And it's time to release the offender from the prison that you have erected by refusing to forgive. There's only two solutions that I know of, really. I'll close with this. The first is to nail it to the cross. You know, how do you become a forgiver? You take the wound and the sin that someone else has done to you, and you take it and the fact that you don't want to forgive them, and you nail it to the cross of Jesus Christ, figuratively. If we had one here tonight, I've been in services before where people are invited to do exactly that, to write down the name of the person or persons for whom you are struggling so deeply to forgive. In fact, you may have even said, I can't and I won't. And then to nail that person's name to the cross, because there's nowhere else to take it. A counselor cannot help you forgive. A pastor can't help you forgive. A friend cannot help you forgive. Somewhere you and God must, in prayer, do business together where you say, God, I release this person, and I nail her sin, his sin that wounded me or someone I loved to your cross. You know what? Nail it again and again. Nail it again and again and again. Nail it again and again and again and again until the power of that wound no longer has the power to hold you in prison. Second thing, start right now. Start right now. I mean, tonight, you're going to have the opportunity. That's what I'm going to release you to do in just a moment, is for you to, in prayer and with other sisters who are just as human as you are, who have just as much trouble forgiving as you do, who have been wounded in many ways like you, and everybody's got at least one place that we're holding on to unforgiveness. And maybe you'll feel comfortable enough to share it, but at least in your mind, release them to God. Release them to God, so that there can be restoration. It doesn't mean that you have to be back in the same relationship with a person who has abused you or wounded you. If you've been a victim of domestic violence, I am not saying say it's okay and walk back into that situation. I am not saying that if someone has betrayed you over and over and over again, that you should just say, oh, it's okay, I release you, and you walk back into that. No, that is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about what happens on a spiritual basis, where you walk out of that prison where you have been, and you start tonight. Let me pray with you, and then I'll release you to pray in the same prayer groups for yourself, for our family, because the truth is, if we really wanted to be and get honest and get into each other's business, some of you don't like each other. Some of you have been wounded by other church members. You may have been wounded by somebody on staff. You may have been wounded by somebody, a Bible study leader, or somebody in your Bible study group, or somebody you've been in ministry with, and they've hurt you. And honestly, when you see them at church, you do your best to just kind of go. It's a big place. You can just kind of go other directions, and you can go for years and never, ever, ever make it right. It doesn't work in your personal life. And it doesn't work in the life of our church. And it doesn't work in the life of your family. And it doesn't work in our world. When we go through this world, even though we have been forgiven an unbelievable debt, if we go through life as unforgivers, somewhere in ourselves, we will pay a price. We will pay the price for refusing to forgive. So let me just pray for you, and then you can scatter together for that 7 minutes of praying together. Jesus, you've set an impossible task in front of us. None of us have the power or the ability to release those who have wounded us in our core places of our heart. God, we don't even like to forgive people who steal our parking places, let alone those who have really, truly wounded us. But God, may we be absolutely overcome tonight with gratitude that we are the forgiven. We are the forgiven. Jesus Christ, you have forgiven a debt we couldn't pay. Now may we in turn live that out in our relationship with you, in our relationship in our families, in our relationships in this church, and in our relationships in our world.